Hey everybody, this is Death by D4, and this is the story of when my players, stole a plant girl's melons. Yeah, there's a lot to go over, so be sure to subscribe and let's dive right on in. So this story comes from a one-shot that I ran about a year ago. It was an escape from a deserted island sort of one-shot, with notable callbacks to jokes and themes presented in beach episodes and animes. To say the least, my players were actually pretty excited to play in it, so much so that I ended up running the game for 8 people. Yeah, seriously, goes to show what kind of people I'm friends with, I guess. Anyway, as the session started, my players awoke upon the coastline of a tropical island with no memory of how they got there, and with no immediate means in which to sail off of it. Then, after taking account of what little inventory they had left, they suddenly noticed that one of the party members was actually unaccounted for. So, in an attempt to try and find them, they then took off down the coastline in search of their lost party member. Thankfully, it didn't take them too long before they found them, but the situation surrounding their lost friend was a bit strange to say the least. You see, thankfully, their party member was still alright. However, to everyone's surprise, they had found them inexplicably buried up to their neck in sand and were completely unable to move. Moreover, they were seemingly guarded by a pack of territorial giant crabs, some of which were actually coming alarmingly close to their friend's vulnerable head. So, seeing as they were in need of rescuing, my players then attacked the giant crabs in an attempt to save their friend from impending danger. Admittedly, it ended up being far more difficult of an encounter than I'm sure anyone expected, but once the dust had settled, they were able to free their party member from the depths of their sandy prison and set out to make camp for themselves along the coastline. At that point, most of the day then went by without much to talk about. That said, some players did end up getting attacked by a panther while out in the jungle, and some even got attacked by a pack of reef sharks while fishing out for debris in the shallows. That said, they were able to secure themselves quite a lot of useful materials doing this, one of which being actually this magical shark tooth necklace that was pulled out of the stomachs of one of the reef sharks. So overall, I'd have to say they did a pretty good job securing food and shelter for themselves for the evening. Or at least all of them with the exception of one, who was a player who then decided to just venture out across the coastline all by themselves. To say the least, when this player didn't actually return by sundown, this made everyone in the camp kind of nervous, so much so that they then sent out a small search party to look for them. In reality, I had actually kinda just forgotten about this player, but that didn't stop me from actually resolving the event properly after that point. You see, while they'd been out exploring the coastline on their own, my player had come across the most unusual tabaxi girl that they'd ever seen. One whose body hair was stripes of pink and black, and one whose eyes were a brightly mismatch of green and cyan. Yeah, seriously. At the very least, I guess you could say the island wasn't entirely deserted after all, but still. Anyway, upon greeting the tabaxi girl, she then introduced herself as Lion. However, upon actually trying to communicate with her any further than that, my player then quickly discovered that this strange tabaxi girl was actually very difficult to actually talk to. You see, Lion suffered greatly from the irritable qualities of being a terrible person, and would just dismiss everything that the player said as either stupid or unworthy of her time. That said, my player was able to learn that there were in fact other people still on the island, so it's not like the whole encounter had been for nothing. So with their pride a little bit bruised from Lion's relentless onslaught of terrible insults, my player then finally decided to head back off in the direction of the rest of the party. At that point, I then cut back to the rest of the players chilling back at the beachside camp, where they then heard noises coming off from the jungle behind them. Upon inspecting it, they then suddenly found that their camp was surrounded by a horde of tribal warriors, all of which were these beautiful and eerily identical elvish women. Well, seeing as they were literally surrounded by like 20-to-1 odds, my players then made the sensible decision of surrendering to their captors. That said, when it came to my encounters with the other players, they actually decided to try and fight back against them. To say the least, well, you could probably guess how that went for them. Anyway, after being captured by the elvish warriors, the party was then brought back to their village deep within the jungle, where it seemed as if they were about to be cooked alive and eaten by the tribe. However, upon doing everything in their power to actually avoid this from happening, they then caught the attention of the tribe's leader, who then appeared before them to address the players. This tribal leader, who reigned over the society of beautiful elvish women, was none other than Brorf, the king of Everisle. A hulking human male with an accent unlike anything they'd ever heard of. There, he stepped out in front of the players, brandishing a pair of terrifying bone-clad knuckle dusters upon his hands, and demanded to know why his marvelous feast was being delayed. However, after talking to him for a little while, my players then realized that Brorf was actually a complete idiot. And not only were they able to convince him into letting them go, but they were actually able to convince him into helping them escape from the island as well. Sure, this was a bit strange to say the least, but I think my players were more than willing to accept things as they were only just about to get strangers moving forward. Anyway, after talking to Brorf for a bit, my players were able to learn of a special tribal rite that would allow them then to travel off of the island. However, in order to perform this rite, they would need to acquire 3 special items from the island's guardians. Elround seeds from Widow's Grotto, freshwater jelly from Maiden's Basin, and a strand of nymph hair from Everisle's Peak. Certainly this was going to be a task for another day, especially since most of the party had gotten pretty banged up in the early encounters with the tribal warriors. So they then decided to rest up there at the tribal village and set out on their quest the following day. Early the next morning, as the players prepared themselves for the long journey ahead of themselves, one of my players then asked for directions to the locations of the island's guardians. Well, seeing as this was actually the best option made available to them, Borf then gave the party his magical knuckle dusters. You see, his knuckle dusters weren't just these fancy magic weapons, but they also imparted the wearer with an infallible sense of direction, allowing them to quite literally be shown the way. So with their new magic item in tow and their bearings headed straight, my party then set out into the jungle and headed to the first of the island's guardians. A short while into their journey, my party then came across Lion again, who was just chilling around the branches of the tree canopy overhead. After introducing herself to the rest of the party, she then went about her usual behavior of ignoring their questions and offering only insults for conversation. However, upon observing her behavior for a moment, one of my players then figured out how they could actually get Lion to talk to them properly, and that was by indulging her in her favorite activity, catty gossip. By doing this, one of my players was able to ask Lion all that they knew about the nearby island guardian, to which she seemed to inform them that her name was Lychee, and that she was this terribly selfish girl who was only interested in men and food. Well, that was certainly information that could be used well in hand, and seeing as Lion had just gotten up and left without saying goodbye to the rest of the party, my players then formulated a plan to appease Lychee and then get the Alron seeds they were looking for. You see, during the previous evening, when my parties were resting at the tribal village, they had actually acquired some fruit known as pawsberries from the local women. These pink, paw print-shaped fruits were actually very delicious. However, if a non-feline creature were to eat one of them, they would have to make a constitution saving throw, and on a successful save, they'd be paralyzed for 1d8 minutes. However, on a failed save, they would then be paralyzed for 1d8 hours. Yeah, seriously. To say the least, a number of players actually ended up becoming lawn ornaments during the previous evening. But since the berries seemed pretty useful, one of my players actually decided to pocket a handful of them for later. Well, seeing as Lychee was primarily interested in men and food, one of my players then decided to combine their water flask and the pawsberries to create a pawsberry smoothie, and then have one of the guys offer it to Lychee. Then, once she was paralyzed by it, they would then be able to freely take her Alron seeds without any resistance. Honestly, it was a pretty good plan for them to come up with it on the spot. That's it, is that actually what happened? Well, no, because of course it's never what happens. So once the party had arrived at Widow's Grotto, they then descended down into the bowels of the deep and dark cave laid before them, where they eventually came upon an enormous flowering plant. Then, upon approaching it, they watched as the central bulb then opened up, revealing Lychee, a beautiful plant girl adorned by colorful flora, sharpened thorns, and bountiful fruits. At this point, Lychee then introduced herself to the players before asking them why they were there. Now, at this point, they really should have just offered Lychee the pawsberry smoothie. But, in a moment that I can only assume was total mental obscurity on somebody's part, one of my players then just blurted out to Lychee that they had come seeking her seeds, which then caused her to scream and cover her chest. Yeah, at this point, everybody sort of just realized that the fruits upon Lychee's chest were actually where her seeds were. Quickly, one of my players then held up the smoothie and tried to offer it to her to try and calm her down, but because they had just upset her so badly, she then ended up whipping one of her vines across the flask and scattering it all over the nearby wall. Well, seeing as their plan had just immediately failed, my players had then made one last desperate attempt to ask Lychee if there was absolutely anything they could do for her in return for one of her seeds. Well, after eyeing over the party for a little bit, Lychee then calmed herself down a little bit and turned her eyes towards the men. She then told them that her fruits actually took quite a deal of time and nourishment in order to form for her, so if they were willing to feed her exactly what she needed, she would then grant them one of her fruits. Seemed like a good deal, right? Well, unfortunately, the food that Lychee requested in particular was the blood of men. I mean, come on, she's an Alron, or an Allura Une for those of you that are more familiar with that term, so of course that's what she wanted. Well, seeing as most of the players that were there were actually male, they then decided they would try and satiate Lychee's hunger, and thus, one of the male players then stepped forth and offered his blood to Lychee. Slowly, her thorny vines then sprouted out from beneath their feet and wrapped themselves around the player, restraining them. Then, as her thorns then began to pierce into their skin, the magical shark tooth necklace that they were wearing from earlier actually activated. Yes, by complete and random chance, the player who had the shark tooth necklace actually was the one who stepped forward and offered themselves to Lychee, and in doing so, unlocked the potential hidden deep within their necklace. You see, this shark tooth necklace imparted resistance to piercing damage to whoever was wearing it, meaning that Lychee was now going to be able to feed off of that player without causing them any significant harm. Seriously, talk about a happy accident for them. Well, as Lychee then began to crush and absorb the player's blood, the other players then began to notice a major shift in Lychee's personality. One that can only be best described as, a lot of squirming, shaking, and, inappropriate noises. Yeah, to say Lychee was really starting to enjoy herself. So much so, actually, that a couple of my party's mages then did what they felt was the smartest thing they could do at that particular moment. They both cast Mage Hand, reached out towards Lychee's chest, and ripped off her melons while she wasn't paying attention. Instantly, the shock of her losing her fruits then stunned Lychee, granting one of the other players enough time to be able to rip their friend out from within her thorny grasp. And then, like a flash into the night, they took off out of the grotto, escaping before Lychee was able to catch them. So, once outside, the parties then took a moment to properly inspect Lychee's voluptuous fruits, before pocketing them away for later within their packs. With that task accomplished, they then set out towards the next island's guardian. Now, I have to admit, was I prepared actually at all for them to just yoink her fruits like that and run? Strangely enough, yes. But they certainly didn't believe me when I said this to them. So, did such other weird and crazy things happen with the other island guardians? Well, maybe that's just going to be a story for another day. And that's it. If you liked the video, then be sure to subscribe and let me know what you think down in the comments below. And if you'd like to have the chance to play D&D with me, then feel free to join my Discord server. And consider supporting me over on Patreon. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see all of you in the next video.